Hey guys, Stick Figure Historian here. Thanks for tuning in to the Scotland series. Last week, we left off with King Alexander III riding off the cliff. Yeah. And as if that's not bad enough, he didn't even leave a child to take the throne after him. His two sons, Alexander and David, had died very young. Even his daughter, Margaret, was no longer living. But unlike her brothers, Margaret had a child. She had married King Eric II of Norway and given birth to a girl, also called Margaret. Though she was better known by her name, the Maid of Norway. Thus, this little 3-year-old princess was the last heir left to take the crown of Scotland. Rightfully named heir though she was, that didn't mean that the Maid of Norway was immediately accepted by her subjects. When King Eric's counselor came over to Scotland to formally claim the throne for her, Robert Bruce, the Lord of Annandale, armed his men and began a rebellion against the new queen. Perhaps he was afraid that Scotland would actually be ruled over by Norway, since the princess was too little to speak for herself. Bruce's rebellion was quickly crushed, but it didn't matter. King Eric was now very anxious about his daughter's safety. He would not send her to her mother's country until he knew for sure that the matter was settled and she would be in good hands. He turned for help to King Edward I of England, an old ally of his. King Edward readily agreed. Of course he would help the little princess. She was his grandniece after all. He swore to do anything he could to help keep the peace in Scotland for her. But of course, he did not only agree to this out of the kindness of his heart. There was something in the deal for him as well. Edward asked that his son, the young Prince Edward, would be betrothed to the Maid of Norway. This was not a thing unheard of. Many times before, the royalty and nobles of both countries had made alliances through marriage. But this time, it was no mere alliance that King Edward sought. Deep down inside, the king cloaked a greater scheme, for he desired to rule both countries for himself. King Edward was a very greedy man, you see. Just recently, he had crushed and conquered Wales, and even now he was waging war with the King of France, in order that he might regain some of the old northern territories of the Angevin Empire. And here's a map of that old empire, just to give you an idea of how extensive it was. This is what all of England's territory was during the reign of King Henry II, King Edward's great-grandfather. It was lost pretty quickly after Henry's death, but many attempts have been made to reclaim it. Anyway, always Edward wanted more and more land. And here, with the death of Alexander III, he saw a perfect chance to try and seize Scotland too. Edward talked with the Scottish nobles about the terms of the future marriage between the little prince and princess. Of course, Edward didn't tell them what he was secretly wanting. He only said that he wished the Prince Edward would rule the kingdom equally with Margaret. This way, when Edward I himself died, England and Scotland would be united under one king and queen. But the nobles didn't really like that idea very much. They wanted Scotland to remain independent of England. The talking went on for nearly 3 years. But at the last, in July of 1290, the Treaty of Bergen settled matters. Margaret would indeed marry the young Prince Edward in the future, but she would be queen, and queen alone. Young Edward could not claim the throne of Scotland for his wife's sake. Both the English king and the Scottish nobles seemed contented with the terms. It was a very beautiful ship which came to fetch the Maid of Norway. It had been outfitted by King Edward himself, and was finely decorated, as well as loaded with fine foods and sweets. The little princess was sure to have a most enjoyable passage across the North Sea. The weather was even fair to speed her journey along. But along the way, the princess suddenly grew quite ill. She grew weaker and weaker, so that her guardians at last asked the captain to land the ship on Orkney, a group of isles lying off the Scottish coast. They hoped to continue on to the mainland once she made good recovery. To their anguish, the Maid of Norway only grew worse, and a few days later, she lived no more. Had nothing to do with the food being poisoned or anything like that, I'm sure. Because perfectly healthy little girls just drop over sometimes. But that's just my speculation. You can judge for yourself by future events. Scotland was once again without king or queen. The death of Alexander had been bad enough, but now her troubles were truly to begin. Nobles all over the realm rose up and claimed their right to take the throne. Nearly all of them had some kind of distant family connection with royalty, though some more distant than others. But each of them thought his claim the strongest, and so the strife began. There were many claimants, but it was only two that truly had any truth or power to back their words. John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. Men all over the country began to pick sides and take up arms. It seemed as if Scotland was about to be torn in pieces by civil war. The nobles realized that the only way that one of them was truly going to rule was if someone besides themselves judged their case. Someone completely outside of the situation. They turned to King Edward, asking him to decide who among them was the rightful king. Yeah, seriously. Obviously, this was a very foolish thing to do. I have told you already about the greedy nature of the English king. Even now, after the death of the Maid of Norway, he had tried to assert that his son still had rights to be King of Scotland. He had craftily worded a few things in the Treaty of Berghem that could be read to give the prince that right, and he insisted that the contract still stood, even though the princess was no longer alive. Of course, his preposterous claims had been rejected, but for the Scottish nobles to call on him now to judge the case between them was pure foolishness. Edward replied that he would help them on one condition. The nobles must call him their Lord Paramount. In other words, the big boss. At first, the nobles were a bit aghast. The only person with the authority to agree to Edward's terms was a king, and they had none. They told him they couldn't call him their lord. The English king was so infuriated at their response that he wouldn't even allow it to be recorded in the public records. But when his anger died, he softened. and he tried again to pry upon the nobles. And in time, the nobles relented. They knew they didn't really have the authority, but they felt they had no choice. They named Edward as their master. Thus, in 1292, a court was called in Berwick-upon-Tweed, just on the border between Scotland and England. All the greatest nobles of Scotland had come, and King Edward sat in the seat of judgment over them. Balliol and Bruce stood in anticipation, each sure of his own right to the crown. That crown, in the hands of a man who had no true right to give it.